All right, we are on live now. Okay, hi everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Can I do the introduction in Portuguese? And then I switch to English? Ok. Pessoal, bom dia, boa tarde. Eu estou muito feliz de ter esta oportunidade de compartilhar esse painel com fantásticas pessoas, professores e pesquisadores. E eu vou começar com uma breve introdução, né? Estamos aqui com o IBCI, Instituto Brasileiro de Concorrência e Inovação, iniciando o ano de 2021, que seja uma bênção para todos, não é? Com vacina, com liberdade, com trânsito real de pessoas, e que a gente possa continuar repetindo esses eventos virtuais, mas também possamos escolher em realizar alguns presenciais, né? Ninguém mais aguenta ficar em casa. Bom, iniciando com o professor Félix. O professor Félix é Associate Dean of Faculty and Research and Professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Professor Felix is a visiting professor at University of Grass, and National Taiwan University College of Law. Professor Felix will be cited by Professor Luciana Young. Professor Luciana é uma PhD em Economia pela FGV. Ela é professora de Economia, de Análise Econômica do Direito no INSPER. Ela é fundadora e já foi presidente da Associação Brasileira de Direito e Economia. I'm just translating from English into Portuguese, ok? Eu não vou falar de mim, falo do professor, meu amigo, de quem admiro muito, professor Vinícius Klein, que é PhD, eu vou ler em inglês agora, PhD in Private Law na UERJ, PhD in Economic Development na Federal do Paraná e professor de Direito e Economia na Federal do Paraná, Escola de Negócios. E além disso, ainda quando sobra um tempinho, ele é advogado, procurador do Estado do Paraná e também é diretor do IBCI. Então, com vocês, Professor Felix. Now switching to English, Professor Felix, the word is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Vinicius for inviting me and setting this up. It's such a pleasure to be here with both of you today and with Luciana as well on this workshop to explore quantitative methods in regulation and antitrust. So the question I'd like to explore today is how we properly balance between antitrust or competition concerns on one hand and regulation on the other. And to do so, how we might be able to enlist some novel quantitative methods, especially what's developing very quickly nowadays are quantitative legal methods or computational legal methods. I think we can enlist those to determine that balance. Let me begin by saying that at an economic and institutional and doctrinal level, and also as a doctrinal legal matter, I think the answer of how you balance between competition concerns and regulation depends greatly on the context. In the US, there are sectoral regulators, and they have vastly different considerations. So, for instance, the Food and Drug Administration focuses on consumer safety. The Environmental Protection Agency focuses on environmental protection. And in the area where I've done most of my work, which is finance, you have an alphabet soup of regulators from the SEC to the OCC to the CFTC, and they oversee various things from the safety, soundness, efficiency, and disclosures in the financial system. So depending on industry, competition doesn't really fit neatly into sectoral priorities. There's a great deal of literature, for instance, on whether competition promotes or undercuts the safety and soundness of banks. So the question then is, how can we determine that balance, the balance between antitrust and regulation? I'll explore this question today, starting from antitrust, and then I'll move to financial regulation and picking an example from where competition and sector-specific concerns of systemic risk might seem like they're most misaligned. So let me begin with the question from the antitrust side of how federal courts think about the balance between antitrust and regulation. Let me introduce to you this project that grew out of a collaboration with the University of Cincinnati's Digital Scholarship Center. This is DSC for short. DSC, with the help of funding agencies, in particular the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, has built this platform that uses topic modeling. So topic modeling is an algorithm that maps the statistical relationships between words in a corpus of documents. You can feed into the platform large volumes of legal documents, which for us, as I'll illustrate, are case law. And what DSC has done is it's partnered with various units of our university, the University of Cincinnati, to run topic models on various things. So when they partnered with the medical sciences, they can run topic models on, say, pain indicators to see the word pain, what it's associated with. They've done things like looking up the citations of authors in biodiversity cases across the world to see where authors are most cited. And then they can even do visual topic modeling to look at things like the placement of bone in archaeological excavation sites. I've been tinkering with this project pretty slowly. So my project uses topic modeling algorithms and the platform that DSC built to detect latent patterns in antitrust case law. Let me frame this part of the talk by starting with what I see as the obstacles to big data research on legal texts. The first obstacle is that there's always been this lack of easily accessible legal data. So data that's easily extracted and easily processed. For this part of the talk, let me begin to share my screen. And I'd like to illustrate what the folks at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School have been doing. So for the past few years, Harvard Law School's law library has digitized every published decision in a US jurisdiction. It's virtually every published decision. So this is their website. It's case.law. And you can see a quick snapshot of the figures that there are over 6.7 million unique cases and over 1.7 unique federal cases. Now, for our purposes, we focus mainly on federal antitrust law and policy. So I'm really looking at this corpus of federal cases. The Case Law Access Project makes it really easy for scholars to download cases in bulk. They also have some rudimentary functions like historical trends. So here, let me go to another window to show their historical trends function. You guys are all seeing that okay, right? Okay, so this is the historical trends function, and I've simply typed up the search for federal cases, which you see in this colon US, and then you have antitrust and regulation. So here you see the ebb and flow of antitrust and regulation cases compared over time. So what makes the Case Law Access Project's data so really easy is that if you're in legal research, you can download the data pretty easily, especially if you're in a nonprofit sector or academia, and that really lowers the barrier for legal research services. Before what we did, so for instance, when I started the project, we had negotiated for months with Lexis and Westlaw, which are the two incumbent legal research databases in the US, just to get licenses. And in the end, it never really panned out. But then the Case Law Access Project came online. So that makes it really easy. That's the first problem. And so the barriers to easily accessible data is really, really beginning to lower. Now, the second problem is one of modeling. So in a lot of big data analysis or empirical work, it can be really difficult to translate models into visualizations or depictions that an audience can intuitively grasp. Now, a lot of this work is already being done in the subset of law called computational legal analysis. And that's really exploring the question of whether and how you can model legal reasoning. That's a subject of many papers. So for instance, Mike Livermore at the University of Virginia has this online workshop where they do a lot of work in computational legal analysis. So the project that we've done is we've used topic modeling, which, as I've introduced earlier, is this algorithm that maps the statistical relationships among words. So let me then share something else and show you the platform that we've built. So this is the platform that we've built, the Digital Scholarship Center at the University of Cincinnati. So you can see all their partners here, and my partnership with them is Case Law. So we've extracted hundreds of thousands of cases from the Case Law Access Project. We've extracted two corpuses. So the first corpus is every federal case with the word antitrust in it. So these are all published decisions in the federal courts, and that's about 35,000 federal decisions. And the second corpus that we've done is every federal case with the word regulation in it. That's much more voluminous. It's about 10 times bigger. So that's about 306,000 cases. So for our purposes today, I'm narrowing down these two corpora into a smaller corpus of every case with their word antitrust and regulation. And by the way, the Case Law Access Project begins in about 1781, and they've only digitized decisions all the way up to 2018. So if I run my search for antitrust and regulation here, the platform returns 7,308 unique results. What I can do, so you can see the histogram of these cases over time, where they've really increased over time. That's not surprising for a number of reasons. One, you've got more proliferation of regulation over time. With the advent of the regulatory state, really after the 1960s, you also have a lot more antitrust litigation over time. So those two patterns cohere. Now here what I can do, because that's a really large corpus to run a search on for topic models, you can filter, and what I sometimes will do is I'll filter here where I try to get the occurrence of search terms. Going to the right on the x-axis means you have documents where the search terms occur more than, say, 25 times. Okay, so let me illustrate for you 3 types of topic models that we've generated. And if there are any questions, please stop me at any moment. I'm happy to expound on the methodologies or to go into the results further. Okay, so the first is, this is Python LDA visualization. So LDA is short for latent Dirichlet allocation. That's the most prevalent topic modeling algorithm. It was used early on in the pioneers of topic modeling. Out of Stanford University, for instance, they had the Stanford dissertation browser. And then another early use was to recommend scientific academic articles across disciplines to break down disciplinary silos. So sometimes when I run a research project, I'll begin here because it spatially illustrates how far the topics are from one another. So just a quick primer, again, topic modeling, what it does is you feed the whole corpus of text. Say I've got, 7,308 unique federal decisions with the word antitrust and regulation. I further filter them down to decisions where those two words occur more than, say, 25 times in a decision. Now you run topic modeling on them and they will say, okay, we see that there are clusters of words that tend to be closely associated together. So we'll form topics out of those words. And so here you see, for instance, this is a topic with the word claim, state, federal, allegation, dismiss. This seems to be more procedural topics that they're in this quadrant here. It's closely related to this topic where you've got these terms here, claims, property, right, allegation. But they're very far removed from here where you've got, it seems to be, you've got market competition. So these are probably more core antitrust cases. You've got merger cases here. So in this quadrant, but they're closely aligned with, so this looks like some sort of regulatory body. So you've got service, FCC is a Federal Communications Commission. That's the telecom regulator. Indeed, you see telephone companies, carriers. So these are kind of your regulated utilities. So this is your power utility quadrant here. So I'll begin usually here to kind of get a view of how far these topics are from one another. And then later, then I'll move to not that one, but this one. So this is now the topic browser view of all of these cases. So these are all generated from earlier packages. So this one is a software package that had been devised by the digital humanities scholar Andrew Goldstone. So here, there are different ways of looking at this. I find this is the most useful, where you can see topics and how they've changed over time and their proportion to the entire corpus. So this is again, antitrust and regulation. I filter down to here, you see 4,189 cases. These are the topics. So here in the right-hand side, you see the proportion that each topic comprises of the corpus. Here, they're numbered, topic 19, and then here is a very basic histogram of the number of cases that have changed over time. And here you see the top words. So DSC has built this platform to be very user-friendly. So if we click on a topic, topic 19, we see the top documents. The top documents, for our purposes, means the top cases. So you see some of the top cases in this topic, and then you see some of the top terms here. And you can also click on a case to see what other topic it comes up in. And then you can also click on particular words. Let's just say we're interested in merger. to see all the different topics that it comes up in. So merger comes up in this topic. Let's say we're interested in price. Price comes up across all of these multiple topics. In the topic browser review, one of the things that I think is most useful is to see how the composition of cases has changed over time. So this is a stacked view of all the histograms. And each color represents a topic. I think that this is particularly interesting because this illustrates a couple of things. You can see right away that cases have diversified over time. So in the antitrust regulation corpus, you've got more different kinds of cases over time, and they span over different industries and regulatory schemes. But there are some other big picture trends that are kind of notable. I think that you see the decline in importance of some cases or some topics. So this is, you can see over time the declines clearly of a lot of topics that have to do with regulated utilities. So in the US, we used to have the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. That was the main utilities regulator. And so over time, that has been supplanted. And that coheres with a broad pattern that a lot of scholars and policymakers have noted, which is one of deregulation. Sometimes it's called deregulation, where the ICC has been supplanted by like by telecom cases and other garden variety antitrust litigation over time. So that's what these topics illustrate, the growth of a lot of more procedural cases. But the deregulation trend that you have in the US is where kind of the paradigm is entirely different. So instead of intense regulation or rate setting, over time, what agencies have done is they're more interested in setting the baseline for competition. So you have cases or regulatory agencies that aren't really regulating that intensely anymore, but are just setting some ground rules to level the playing field. So this is the topic browser view. And the last thing that I'll share is something that the DSC has built, and this is something that's perhaps more proprietary. So it can be really hard, they figured out, for you to get a sense of context. So the major criticism of a lot of computational legal analysis is that it's hard to tell exactly what this means. You don't have very much context. The fields where this originated, which is the humanities, they're very used to close readings of text in close textual analysis, which is what you normally do in legal analysis as well. So it's really difficult to get an understanding of the text. So DSC tried to solve this problem by saying, well, you can aggregate topics together to get topic clusters, just like you can aggregate words together to get topics. So this gets you a more meta view of the evolution of these topics in terms of how topics cluster. So here you see where the topics cluster, you see this right-hand panel that shows you the clusters, and it shows you all the different topics. And then in the center, it shows you these huge nodes where in the center, the big nodes are clusters of topics, and then the smaller nodes are topics, and you can break them down into the main terms. So a few things are noticeable as we go down. So you see these huge nodes. So this looks like some sort of procedural cluster. But then later you begin to see sectoral clusters. So you've got commissions. So these are probably old ICC cases. Indeed, you've got the FCC cases here. Later you can see banking cases. Those are the ones in purple. There's always like a patent case. Oftentimes you'll see hospital clusters. So as we see here, insurance. So you begin to see the vocabulary cluster around certain terms, and the clusters or the topics themselves will cluster as well. So that shows you that the vocabulary that courts are using to think about the balance between antitrust and regulation is very sector specific. Now, let me give you a couple more illustrations. So for instance, in my field, which is mainly in finance, you can click on a cluster and then that opens up a topic. Then we can click on that and they'll give you the largest terms. Here, this gives you the top cases. We built in a rudimentary case retrieval function where we can click on the top case and it'll bring you up the text of the decision. And this is all, again, from data thanks to the Case Law Access Project. A couple of other ways of depicting this. So we can do a circle view in which we see the the way certain terms cut across different topics. So this is the term federal. Price cuts across a lot of different topics. This is competition. And then finally, network view. It's from like a neural network architecture. It shows you spatially how these clusters align. Okay, so this is what we've done. And then this just, I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can see everybody. So this shows you how federal courts think about antitrust and regulation. You see that really their vocabulary depends on the sector in which they're weighing this stuff. Now there are probably some imprecise things. So the weakness of this methodology is that sometimes you're splicing text in a way in which the drafters, that is the judges who are writing the opinions, didn't necessarily intend. You might have a little bit of model instability where if you run different searches, sometimes you might get different models over time. That tends to disappear with aggregated multi-level view that I showed you, the last one, because they aggregate things up to the cluster level. So you have a lot more stability. There are other criticisms as well. So again, let me just highlight the results. So the results is that we have these huge clusters when we're thinking about antitrust and regulation, and they correspond to the regulatory frameworks. And again, they suggest that the vocabulary around antitrust and regulation, and perhaps by inference doctrinal analysis, is going to be really dependent on sectoral context. Now, I think I have some more time, but again, please, I'll pause. So if I'm not screen sharing and I can see everyone, please just interrupt me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will continue. So let me shift gears and focus more specifically on one industry. I think I have like 10 minutes. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts. And so I'll pause in each part in case I run out of time, and also to take, again, questions as well. So let's think about this more specifically from the industry that I am most familiar with, which is finance. So I'll talk to you about this balance between antitrust and regulation and what it looks like from finance. So again, the setup is that from federal cases, you see that this is very sector specific. So we've got to look at each sector very, very closely. So let's look at this. So I'm going to show you this. Okay, so can you see this one where it's the quantitative methods one? No. Okay, let me share that again. I have too many windows open, sorry. Okay. Okay, here we go. I think you can see this one now. Okay. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to illustrate for you how this balance between antitrust and regulation might look in a specific context. So all right, so I'm going to look at this from the perspective of finance, and in particular, the derivatives market. So this is a very rudimentary model that we have where, this talks about how markets can be distorted if you've got powerful players. If you've got, this is a very familiar graph to most everybody, where what happens when you got the entry of a monopoly or some sort of cartel or oligopoly is that you reduce the quantity of production so that you raise prices. So that's very familiar. So now let's move to something that's more specific. Let's move to one particular market. And by the way, that distortion happens whether you've got a monopoly or whether you got a cartel of small players. Like in airlines in the US, there are 4 carriers that dominate. Credit cards, there are really 3 issuers of credit cards that dominate. What turns out that in the market for financial derivatives, they exhibit really the same oligopolistic behavior. So derivatives are financial instruments whose values are based on the fluctuations of referenced instruments. So those variables might be, for instance, the movement of interest rates, the price of stock, whether a party defaults on the loan. Derivatives can heighten otherwise direct and straightforward risk in a couple of ways, because you've got payments and penalties under derivatives contracts that can be orders of magnitude higher than what the triggering events call for. So the other thing about derivatives is that they tend to link a lot of counterparties in a web of connectivity that we know as systemic risk. So one classic example of a derivative is an interest rate swap, and it works like this. If you've got a borrower who has a variable rate loan, so maybe at an interest rate of say 1-year LIBOR plus 3%, at a time when LIBOR is hovering around, I don't know, 2%. So the borrower doesn't like the fact that the interest fluctuates from time to time. So what do they want to do? They might take out an interest rate swap to mimic a fixed rate. So under the swap, you've got the borrower who now becomes a swap buyer. It'll pay the swap seller a fixed rate of 5%, while the swap seller pays the borrower that floating rate of LIBOR plus 3%. So in this manner, now the borrower's interest is at a steady 5%, which mimics a fixed rate. So what does this have to do with market power in the derivatives markets? Well, what we see here, this is a table that shows the largest in notional amounts. So that is in the amount that the nominal amounts on the face of the derivatives instruments. So the notional amounts of the top 9 bank holding companies in the United States. So these numbers are from the OCC, a banking regulator. They compile quarterly reports of bank derivatives positions. Now, if you look closely, you'll see a market dominated by 5 firms. You've got Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley. Now, usually the more entities you add, the harder that we know from cartel theory, the harder it is to coordinate and to maintain that oligopoly. But this is still a pretty concentrated market, because if you break down the market shares, this is what that looks like of the top 9 bank holding companies and their derivatives positions. And over time, year after year, these 5 firms occupy like 90 to 95% of the market for trading derivatives. So what's interesting is that with the financial crisis, we had the financial reforms. This is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Consumer Protection Act. What this did is it took the derivatives market from one of bilateral clearing. Bilateral clearing was where you had 2 parties trading against one another in this web of connectivity. There was never a central counterparty, but it mandated the interposition of a central counterparty. So now all the derivatives positions have to go through a clearinghouse. A derivatives clearinghouse, one large clearinghouse that will clear all trades. So now you've introduced this infrastructure into the market. Now you do that because that gets you a lot of efficiencies, and also that protects against systemic risk. Because the thinking is that if you've got a few counterparties at default, the central counterparty, the derivatives clearinghouse, it's got enough, it's backstopped enough financially that it can buy the other people out, so it doesn't transmit that risk systemically into the whole system. So now the landscape is you've got different markets. You've got a big central clearinghouse for interest rate swap markets, for credit default swaps, and for oil futures. And this is just the market, or this is just the market shares of your really large clearinghouses. So for interest rate swaps and for credit default swaps, you see that these infrastructures run away with the market share, nearly 100% of the market share. Okay, and so what then you have is the landscape is just a classic thing that you might see from industrial organization, where you've got an upstream market, the upstream market that might be, say, the derivatives trading market. Then everything has to go through a bottleneck. So the bottleneck becomes an indispensable market or an infrastructure to that adjacent market of trading. So the clearing market becomes indispensable. That's the setup, and that's the problem that we have then. So let me quickly walk you through, well, what can we do about this? Do I have maybe 5 more minutes, Eduardo? Okay, all right. So let me share, I've got 2 more segments. And again, if there's any questions, just stop me at any time. So let me go back to this and then show you what we might be able to do about it. So let me look at it from 2 perspectives. So one is the antitrust perspective. So the problem that you might have when you've got one large indispensable infrastructure that's indispensable to an adjacent market is that you have problems of leveraging and foreclosure. And these are problems that Jean Tirole have illustrated really clearly what happens when you've got 2 adjacent markets that come together. So you might fear that You've got the dominance in the clearing markets that's illustrated clearly with the fact that they run away with market share. That might be used to somehow be leveraged or to suppress competition in the adjacent market. So the market for trading derivatives, that's where all the money is, because it's really expensive, a really expensive proposition to buy all these interest rate swaps. So banks make a killing on fees by trading in derivatives. Well, the Sherman Act, it's got a horizontal restraint prohibition, a vertical restraint prohibition. And what the Sherman Act says is when you've got this type of structure, that might be an indispensable facility, something called an essential facility to an adjacent market. So these are the kind of, you can think of these as the elements of an essential facilities claim. And the essential facilities doctrine in antitrust. So now we're in the realm of antitrust in the US now. That's really ebbed and flowed over time. So this is taken from a really prominent Seventh Circuit decision out of 1983 called MCI. But the case law, a lot of the case law on essential facilities was made in the US Supreme Court, and you had ebbs and flows in essential facilities from Ottertail to Aspen skiing to Trinco. Now, the high watermark was probably Ottertail and Aspen skiing in the 70s and 80s, and that's where the court really found that you could, as a plaintiff, articulate this refusal to deal claim if somebody controlled an essential facility and denied you entry. So what might that look like in the derivatives market? It turns out that the clearinghouse members are all the major traders. So a big clearinghouse has this really powerful board called the Risk Mitigation Board or the Risk Control Board. And the members tend to be the largest banks, the largest traders. So it's long been feared that the largest traders would set risk mitigation standards that were really high and would shut out their smaller competitors. And in that way, if their smaller competitors were not adequately capitalized, they can't run their derivatives trades through the clearing houses. And by law, you have to run your trades through the clearing markets. It's hard to find an exemption. So then in this way, the major banks have managed to suppress competition that upstream market by denying entry from the downstream market. So now, in 2003, Trinco came out, and Trinco was notable on a couple of fronts. One is to say that they really peeled back the essential facilities doctrine, and two is to say that if you've got antitrust and regulation, antitrust has to defer to regulation. So finally, in 1 minute or so, let's look at the landscape from regulation. So how does the landscape look from financial market regulation? Well, this is Dodd-Frank. This is a Wall Street Reform Act. So this came out of the financial crisis. Dodd-Frank gives you standards for clearing, which it mandates open access. So this is a standard, but in regulation, the real action is not in the statute, but it is in the rules that are implemented by the agencies. And this is the clearinghouse eligibility rule. So really quickly, it says that DCOs, derivatives clearinghouses, can't adopt any standards that are more restrictive than they need to be. They need to promulgate open access. But the problem is that you've got a sector-specific regulator that's not really specific with how these things work. So the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, is the one that oversees this stuff, and they're just not really used to thinking about competition. Notably, in Dodd-Frank, you have antitrust savings clauses, which say that, well, Dodd-Frank does not preempt antitrust litigation. But the problem is that you have Trinco's, which is on the book, and Trinco has said that if you get antitrust and regulation, antitrust must defer, even where you've got an antitrust savings clause. So the landscape that we're left with is one where antitrust kind of recedes. Regulation is supposed to fill in the void, but under the existing case law, the balance between antitrust and regulation is supposed to be supreme, but the regulatory authorities aren't really well equipped. So I think I'll pause here and I'll look forward to Luciana's paper. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, really, I congratulate you, Professor. It was amazing. I have 2 questions and other many questions after this session, but Professor Luciana, please take the word now.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you for you and Vinicius for organizing this event. I'm so glad to be today with Professor Felix Chang. It's actually an opportunity for us to learn as I mentioned elsewhere before, actually, we are, as a country and as academia, just starting this whole process. And I believe that this theme is actually the future and actually even the present of all kind of legal research. Actually, I don't have a paper. I have a presentation. I prepare a presentation, but my presentation will be much more focused in general reflections and actually some insights that I think that will be incentives for all of us who want to, deal with this area of quantitative methods applied to regulation and antitrust. And I would like specifically to talk about one in the final part of my presentation about one incentive that we have actually that came from the law itself to use quantitative methods to apply for all our research and our analysis. So let me start sharing my presentation. And my agenda, somehow just to organize my talk in this, let me just start my counting my timing here, is to kind of pinpoint some highlights that Professor Chang brought to us that I think are very valuable for our understanding and our analysis in Brazil. And second, I will bring this into our context. I will show you that all of you who are Brazilians know that we are starting in all this process, but actually we already have several opportunities. And as I mentioned, an opportunity, a very good opportunity for us to dwell into really using quantitative methods to study and to analyze regulation and somehow antitrust cases is the law of economic freedom, which we had in 2019, in which it was specifically mentioned the regulatory impact assessment becoming mandatory for all federal laws, for all federal regulation. And now we have this this demand, right, this legal demand to really apply quantitative methods to analyze all regulatory issues. And then in the end, let's try to make a wrap up. So just, excuse me, Professor Chang, but I was just trying to pinpoint some of the topics that you said that I think are very important for us. First, this is a novel methodology, but also very promising. And I personally believe this is going to be the future of all kinds of legal research, economic legal research, which is mainly what I do myself. Second, this is very important for us in Brazil. We must learn how to work in interdisciplinary teams, right? Working in isolated groups with people that only talks your language. This is a thing from the past. We now have to learn how to talk with computer scientists, with lawyers. I'm an economist myself, right? And economists just don't like to talk with lawyers. We have to talk with lawyers. We have to talk with statisticians. We have to talk even with mathematicians and even neuroscientists. This is a must. This is a new requirement for solving real world problems. You cannot solve real world problems only within, your traditional and old friends speaking the same language. But as Professor Chang showed us, there are actually many challenges. And he showed the challenge in the US. In Brazil, they would be even larger, right? First, the lack of reliable data somehow. Second, making the machine to really learn what the human mind, a lawyer's mind is. This legal reasoning is not easy. The effective interdisciplinary teams, it's very easy to kind of, as the college students do when they have these projects, these team projects. So, so A will do this and B will do that and C will do that. This will not work for this kind of machine learning, text mining projects. You really have to sit together, different people from different backgrounds and make things work. Otherwise, there will be many problems, including what I call this human errors. Professor Chang somehow mention that, sometimes judge, we use different wordings. We have like big problems of this in Brazil, but with lawyers, right? So lawyers, we use several, like hundreds of different words for the same thing. And then the person who goes do the tax mining will go crazy because it's just make things just so much more difficult. But these are real challenges that everybody will have to face, and we have to learn how to improve these kind of things, right? So as I said, we still have a lot to learn, to apply to, and actually probably the biggest challenge in Brazil is that we have no tradition. And I say I put myself in the lawyer's side, right? And also for the regulator side. In Brazil, we do not have tradition to make regulations and to make laws based really on some evidence, specifically quantitative evidence, but also of any kind of qualitative evidence and any kind of evidence. So, sorry, I'm an economist, and I'm together with like two Brazilian lawyers, and I'm going to say something bad about the Brazilian legal tradition. But the thing is that in Brazil, it's so easy. Everybody just think that all the problems, social problems, economic problems, political problems will be solved by issuing a new law, a new regulation. So all the problems will be solved simply by passing a new regulation, and that's all. Right? So nothing is done before or even after to really understand and check and monitor whether this regulation really had the intended impacts. And this is a big problem. We have this whole bunch of regulations, sometimes, many times contradicting one the other, and this really causes this big mess. I would give one example. It's not exactly our topic today, but which is the tributary system, the tax system in Brazil. So probably no one in the country really understands all the tax laws in the country, because there are just so many. And every time there is one problem, the legislators will go and create one new law, and just a big confusion, and we just go nowhere. And actually we have many costs about that. On the other side, I want to give like some kind of, hopes, and probably is actually, I hope that the people who are listening to us will also, after hearing to the wonderful talk by Professor Chang, understand that this is really opportunity for us. We do have already some, let's say, achievements, small achievements in this perspective, in the way that, we are trying to look more into evidence, to look more into quantitative data, and try somehow to do some better regulations, right? We see first some initiatives of quantitative methods and also machine learning and all this novel technique in the academia, in academic works, and then slowly also into public policies. So first, I'm very a free market person, right? Everybody knows that. Everything starts from the market. So the first ones in Brazil, probably in the US and in Europe too, who really started to make these things very wide, were the law techs. The first time I was really in touch with tax mining methodologies, and the first time I had a chance to get data to, write an academic paper, it actually came from a law tech. This was like 8 years ago. And that really surprised me. And later on, I just got knowledge of several others. And I think that they are really spreading this technology, this methodology, unfortunately, in a very limited manner, because they are for profit. They're just gonna show to whoever pays for them. Also, consulting firms. We do have economic consulting firms, and also some economic, legal consulting firms using machine learning techniques to write, technical papers and some judicial views. And they are also helping to spread this necessity and showing, for judges, for legislators, for regulators, the benefits for using quantitative methods in making more sound and more based analysis, and convincing them. And every time, from the experience that I have, every time that we go, we write a judicial view for a judge, he or she will be very pleased to have this kind of more sound evidence to make his or her decision. And of course, in the academia, this is also spreading, thanks God. We do have association, think tanks, professional association, academic associations that are dedicated, devoted to developing more the techniques of machine learning for legal usage, right? So in Brazil, we do have some associations like that. We do have centers for research, and also even people, professors or scholars that are offering online courses like Coursera style courses in machine learning, in text mining, again, for legal purposes. So this is a very special niche that starts to pop up. We can start to see that. And also some good news, this is still very at the beginning, but we do have some undergrad law school programs that are teaching their students computer programming. Python, R is more used for the economies, but I can name at least two. These are like private university. One is FGV at Rio. At least I know that they do have this computer programming in the undergrad program, and also INSPER. We are having our first class this year. We just accepted. They are just starting this week, the undergrad, the freshmen, the first class of law school, and they will have mandatory computer programming classes. So this is I think these are very good news, because we really need lawyers who know this technically, because I myself as an economist, although I study law all the time, I'm not able to talk with a computer scientist and tell him or her what kind of wording that are more precise in going for the text mining and doing all the exercises that Professor Chang did with his team at the University of Cincinnati. We really need lawyers who understand that. But as I said, this is also showing up. And also, I always like to emphasize the role played by the Brazilian National Council of Justice, which since its creation in 2004 has been doing a wonderful job in fostering empirical and quantitative and analytical research in law. So since my PhD dissertation and my PhD thesis, I use data from the National Council of Justice, and more specifically in these initiatives with machine learning and quantitative methods, that it's been a while that every year they do have like several calls, the CNJ, National Council of Justice, they'll have several calls for research. These are like 2-year research, big research team projects to foster this kind of initiatives. I can name, the ones that I know because they were carried out in my institution at INSPER. They had one for studying regulation and the health system, the Brazilian health system, and also about the security system. So these are very recent projects that they made this call, and they kind of provided financial support. And these are all machine learning based projects, right? These are huge projects to understand the situation in the whole country, what for, to provide results and analysis for regulators, and in their case specifically for judges, right? For courts to make better decisions based on that. And what we probably still need is probably one journal specifically devoted to quantitative empirical analysis. I'm talking very much into a very academic perspective, and hopefully in a while we will have that. Although we already have several papers, we see like every year we see some publications and pieces of work and even books on the topic. Just to highlight also what I think is our probably biggest asset in Brazil. I always like to make a joke, because economies and everyone loves to complain that we don't have data, we never have data, right? So data is never accessible. This is not an excuse in Brazil, specifically for legal research, right? Why? Well, because luckily, if we have one thing to be proud about as being an academic in Brazil are the judicial databases. So basically, you are lawyers, you know more than I do. All the decisions made at least in the second level and in the higher level courts, they are mostly available. They are not 100% available. We know that, but they are basically available. And if you hire a computer scientist to your team, you will also be able to get data from the first level courts. So this is a reality. And I think that some academics also already know, some foreign academics already, scholars already know about that, because we see more and more, Europeans and North Americans and Asian scholars making partnerships to write papers in Brazil using this kind of database. This is basically, when I did my PhD dissertation 10 years ago, I actually grabbed that, by hand. I didn't use machine learning. I just went to the website, to the Supreme Court website, and I would download one by one. And of course, I had a very limited size, right? But since that time, we do have reliable data, at least related to judicial decisions. And as I said also elsewhere, we are one of the most litigious countries in the world. If you count it per capita, I would say that Brazil is the highest, has the highest litigation rate. So we have like hundreds of millions of cases waiting us to go there and grab someone with the programming and grab and to study whatever we want. I forgot to put this in my slide, but actually, besides the judicial database, we actually also have the Diários da Justiça, right? Which I don't know how would that translate into English.
Official Gazette, Federal Official Gazette, and a State Official Gazette, and even Municipal Official Gazette. So
right. So tons of data every day, right, Eduardo? So these computer science are already learning how to do that, because there's some specific manner. I don't know how, but anyway, we do have lots of data from the judiciary. We also have data from the public attorneys. Vinicius might tell us about that. And actually, one coordinator from the School of the Public Attorneys told me, if you want, we can offer you all our database. It's here. You can use it. It's just fantastic. Also from the public prosecutors. Another regulatory agency, we still have to convince them to make them available, to make them public. But I think that slowly they're also learning how important it is to make this data available for everyone. The good side about having more and more papers and projects in institutions, in educational institutions, is that usually when they finish their project, they will make all the data available. I said the CNJ, the National Council of Justice, just hired INSPER 2 years ago to do some research in the regulation of the health system and also the social security system. So after the project was concluded, all the data now is available publicly. Anyone can just go and get it. This is also one of our commitment with CNJ. And of course, let's not forget, we are dealing with very economic related regulations, economic law, antitrust law, and it's also good to combine with more, let's say, pure economic data. And we also have some good news about that. The central bank has a very good database. Sometimes it's kind of, you have to convince them, but they do have this like very local for every municipality in the country. They have, the amount of loans and even, respecting the privacy issues. You have even, the people who get and the companies, the amount of loans that everyone gets every year. So it's very good to kind of match this kind of data. Just also want to highlight that one of the most well-known papers written recently in Brazil combined, it was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, a very top journal in economics. It was written by an Italian who came for his PhD to Brazil, and also with an employee from the Brazilian Central Bank. And what they did was to merge data from the central banks about loans with judicial databases. And they wanted to measure the impact of the the relatively new bankruptcy law. So it was a very, very well-known paper, and they just did that, combine these two types of database. So we do have some, some examples, just to go very quickly. I was also part of this big team who wrote these books on antitrust cases at courts. It was published in 2014. And also the project that I just mentioned about the healthcare system and also the social security system. And of course, many papers on that regard, on that respect. What I would say that it's really now became a legalistic opportunity is actually a demand, a legal demand, is the law number 13874 issued in 2019, which is the well-known, the law of economic freedom. But actually what it was interesting is that in chapter 4, in the article 5, it mentioned and it's actually required regulatory impact analysis for all federal initiatives in creating new regulations. So this is a demand, this is a legal demand. After the law was passed, several regulatory agencies started, going crazy to learn how to do that. Many of them didn't have this tradition, didn't have this know-how, so they had to go and learn how to do that. But for us who are scholars and who study, this is really a very good sign that now we have many more initiatives in grabbing number and evidence from, ex ante or ex post for all these regulations in the country. I'll also go very quickly into this, what regulatory impact really is. It's really a manner, to make policies and make regulation clear, more effective, more reasonable, and in an economic perspective, we always need that because actually regulation will come whenever we have market failures. But to solve these market failures, we are probably creating many costs also. So we really have to make sure that the cost incurred in creating a new regulation is really worth compared to the benefit that it will bring, right? So only this sort of methodology as the regulatory impact assessments or cost benefit analysis will make this possible, this kind of comparisons. So why? Again, remembering our legal tradition in Brazil, we always want to create regulations and create new laws to solve some kind of problem, but without making any kind of inference. And usually, many times, we will create what I call the boomerang effect, right? You think that you are doing something good for someone or for the society, but in the end, actually, it costs you much more. We have several, actually every day we do have examples, unfortunately, in this sense, right? One national example was the Cruzado Plan in 1986. We were fighting against hyperinflation, and we have this economic team creating these whole new policies that, froze all the prices and several other measures. But in the end, the result were the shortage of basic items and everybody going crazy in the supermarkets, right? This is a very clear sign of regulation of policies that are created without any kind of benefit analysis, cost benefit analysis, or regulatory impact assessment, right? And also every day at courts, we see this kind of, judicial decisions, either the judicial decisions and in the regulatory agencies, laws and legal rules trying to protect someone who we know that probably needs to be protected, but somehow this kind of regulation, this kind of law, in the end will actually harm this same group of people. I could go on and on. This is one of my favorite topics when talking about law and economics in Brazil, but it's just to remember that these kinds of things happen every day in the country. So we do need to make this kind of assessment, right? And also just for a brief information, regulatory impact analysis is made in many places, and specifically in the European Union, this is very frequent, and even in the US, this sort of benefit cost analysis and other sorts of evidence-based policies and regulations, they are much more frequent than they are in Brazil. We also have one example here in what the United Kingdom did with the regulatory impact analysis to evaluate all the norms that were related to entrepreneurship and to the business development. So this is a very useful and applicable tool. Just to remember, and I think that this is also important for us, ex ante and ex post analysis, right? We have to make assessment before regulation is made and also after it is implemented. We need to measure, we need to follow up, we need to monitor. We never do that in Brazil, and which is really a pity, right? With these two things combined, we probably get what we really want, right? Some regulations that really improve well-being in society, and also that fosters entrepreneurship, that fosters economic activity, and so on and so forth. It is worth also mentioning that we are a poor country. We do have, I mean, resources are scarce everywhere, but in a poor country like ours, we really need to know how to use wisely our budget, right? Tax levels in Brazil are already very high, specifically for a country such as ours. We need how to use our money wisely. And also doing this kind of impact assessments is also a must. It's not, you know, a luxury, it's really a must. And going very quickly into the steps for implementation, first, for any kind, and I would say regulation in a very broad manner. I'm not, you know, splitting into, as Professor Chang did, regulations and antitrust laws. I'm just talking about, you know, let's say state intervention as a whole, more into general and broad regulation. We need to define the problem. It sounds silly, but this is very serious, right? It's like when we talk to one student that he or she is planning to write a dissertation, you have first to define your problem. And again, many times we create laws, we create regulations without really focusing on what our problem really is. Second, and I will add shadows in this slide because this is probably the most important part, data collection. To get, you know, to really reach a good and sound and effective, actually the word here is effective regulation, we need reliable information, we need reliable data. And this is when quantitative methods come into the scene. We have, you know, to create regulation and create new laws, not only based on feelings. Oh, I think that we need more hospitals in this place. I think that we need to change the pricing system of the healthcare plans. I guess that this will work out. Or worse, based on good wishes, right? So someone is really, you know, have pity of someone, and I really need to help this group of people. They are poor, they don't have access to education, they don't have access to the healthcare system. Let's do something. Let's create a new regulation that will facilitate their access to all these public services. Even with people and politicians and regulators and judges have good wishes, many times their intentions will not be reached. We need to access how to do that, right? We need to do that in an economic manner without spending too much money and without spending too much time, because for any kind of regulation, the whole country is just waiting for the problem to be solved. There are several methods to be done, but again, we need good and reliable data sources and data methods, right? And then in the end, of course, we will identify the other options that are available and finally make the evaluation. What is really the good one? Let's compare in a quantitative manner. After the regulation is implemented, we really need to go and measure it, monitor, and then probably even decide that that regulation was really a bad idea and that you have to find some ways to solve it. So the ex ante and the ex post planning have to be intercommunicating all the time. Let's measure, let's monitor, and let's see if that really makes any sense. So as I said, my talk was in a very more general perspective, and all this this implementation is about the regulatory impact analysis. As I said, this is a good opportunity for us to finally make quantitative methods a crucial step necessary step in implementing any kind of regulation and any kind of laws in the country. So if I could kind of make a link with what Professor Chang said, I would say that we already had many learnings. Of course, that we are still learning as humanity, as the scholars in Brazil and elsewhere. All these computational methods, they really advance very quickly. You know, these guys have many things to teach us every month probably, but for sure every year there are new methods, and this is really great. We do have in Brazil some achievements, but as a humanity and as scholars, as legal scholars, many achievements. But I will highlight in the opportunity that we have, especially as legal scholars and especially in Brazil too. So these were very brief and very general perspectives on the future of this kind of research. Thank you again for this opportunity. It's really an honor to be here today.
Thank you, Professor Luciana. It was amazing. Well, we reached 1 hour of event, and so we have not much time to go on. Would you mind just stopping sharing your screen, Professor Luciana? That's okay. I made a lot of notes, but I will not do this now with you. But I have a little ponderation that I want to hear Professor Vinicius as well. But I think this is really amazing for law and for people and for society as a whole. But thinking of my country, I mean our country, instead of Professor Felix, I have a doubt and a question to Professor Felix and a fear, I would say, to our country, because the question is how could the US reach a level of standardization or uniformization of terms in terms of language, to build up a huge databases from the 1790s to 2018, right? How could you do this? I mean, it sounds like an utopia for us, in Brazil. And this is a fear that I have, because we don't have uniformization in terms of lexes, as much lawyers as we are, as many lawyers as we are, we write differently, judges write differently. So as you mentioned in the US, and Luciana made it very clear, we might use 100 words for one meaning. So how to deal with that? How you did in the US, and can we do it in the Brazil, Luciana, Professor Luciana?
I can try to take that, Eduardo. So so there's not really standardization in the way judges write their legal opinions. The U.S. still abides by this common law tradition, and common law prides itself on flexibility, and if anything, it's not standardized. So, contrary to what you might see more in civil law jurisdictions, as a common law jurisdictions, I think we're really comfortable with judges using different vocabulary to arrive at justice, because the thought of, courts sitting in equity is that justice is going to depend on the context and will be meted differently in different contexts. So for that reason, there's not really that much standard. I mean, there is some, you might have a little bit more standardization when you talk about terms like, say, market power, even though there is still an open-ended concept as well. But to bring it to something we're more familiar with in antitrust, maybe certain doctrines are informed by a specific set of words. So like in market power, you might see things like anti-competitive or relevant. So there's not as much standardization in the legal text that we've mined from the Case Law Access Project. Now, when you mentioned the official gazette earlier, we have some sort of a model. I mean, when it comes to the regulatory end, we have publications in the Federal Register when rules go live, and also when there's a notice and comment period. And that language is much more standardized because it all comes out of an administrative agency. You might have more variation in the comments that come from the public, but for the most part, I think if we were to unleash topic modeling on the Federal Register, it gives you much more standardized result with much more filler words. So I'm not sure that we'll ever get there just because it's the common law tradition. Now, methodologically, how can we account for changes over time? In the humanities, people who have done a lot more modeling have noted the fact that words can have meanings that will change over time. So there may be things computationally that you can tweak around it. Lexis and Westlaw, for instance, can make sure that the endings of words might be truncated. So like for competition, you can end it at COMPET, and then that will that'll cover competitors, competitive. Other things that make it difficult is anytime you want to use quantitative methods on words themselves, as Eduardo notes, words change over time. So you do have to be sensitive about that. For law, I mean, the US itself, I mean, even if you do go back to the 1700s, for a lot of the decisions that I'm working on, really the corpus really begins to take off in like the 1970s. So there's not that much of a change of usage. People who are doing constitutional law, they're professors at, I think, the University of Chicago who are trying to get at the original meaning of certain words. I think that's really interesting because that proposition is going to, depend a lot more on the change of words over time. But I think methodologically, there are things that you can do to work around it. But so long as you're sensitive of it, I think that's really important. That's exactly right.
Maybe Vinicius can jump in and then final remarks.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think I can do like a question similar to these things, because two things highlighted when I read your paper. I like it a lot, and this was one of the things that I liked it, and I was eager to have this conversation, this event, because the software is very nice. And I remember that when and the papers are very nice. I remember when I started reading about empirical work on contracts, there was this question, like if I have one clause and I start to use in a database, so this is going to be strange because maybe this clause in one contract means something and in another contract is another thing. So like exclusivity clause, that's important for us. Maybe in one contract is important, maybe another is just an ancillary clause and things like that. And I think you try to solve that with relations, with the clusters, because when you can do the relations between 2, 3, or more words, you can try to overcome this limitation. But I think I agree with that, and what you said, it keeps a problem. But I think the relationship between 2 or more words in a cluster is a good step and a clever step to try to overcome that. And one of the things you mentioned is that some of the most leading cases in the books are not the case that appeared on your database, like Trinco, I think, or one of the cases you showed us about regulation and antitrust and financial regulation is something that's important in all the books, but when you use your database, it's not the most cited case. And this is interesting. It's not so much, it's much more theoretical for us in Brazil in civil law, but I think it's very interesting as a methodological discussion. The role of precedents and how do you define a precedent? Maybe you could define a precedent by the software, by topic modeling. Because the precedent should be the case that is the most cited and most used as in the other cases. And I remember Luciano has a study, a very important study about indigenous decisions and the High Court of Brazil, and how that decision was used to clarify and pacify and be really a precedent for other decisions. Because when having the judiciary, the highest court, the Supreme Court, stated a decision, you suppose that all the inferior courts would follow that. And she found that this didn't happen in that case. But how do you think about that? Because there is one of the things that's important in the United States is this methodology of studying by cases. And you found that sometimes the cases are may not well chosen, or it's a political way of choosing the presidents. And could we say that it's better to use as a president the one that is really using in all cases, and maybe shows us that there is a rhetorical use of some precedents. And the second thing, and I'm ending, is just that you said in the beginning of the paper, like, is ideas or tools more important? And I think that's very interesting too, because usually in economics, we try to make a parallel with physics or with mathematics, and the things is that, like, we discover some things in theoretical physics first, then we discover the way of calculating that. And what do you think? Like, do you think this kind of methodology is gonna change the ideas first, or you have just like the new Brodizing, and then they're gonna use the tool? What comes first, in your opinion?
Sure. Thank you, Vinicius. So I heard three questions. So the first was, you had made the analogy to contractual settings. And I think the context here is different. So because we're looking at the Case Law Access Project data, we're looking at federal decisions. So these cases have not settled, they've proceeded, and you've gotten an opinion out of those. So the context is slightly different than in contracts. There are people who are doing this work on contracts, and if they can get the data, then I think what they reveal is really interesting. I think the contractual setting is slightly different. Some scholars have done research on this. Kathy Huang, who's at the University of Virginia, for instance, has done work that talks about like deal momentum. So, sometimes you'll arrive at certain momentum in a deal to barrel forward. And I would think that, notwithstanding what perhaps precise meanings of certain words in contracts are. So there is stuff that's being written using these methodologies. The other thing of where the general question, your second question of where this might go in terms of precedent, that is something that's really interesting that we found, which is the top cases in topic modeling are by definition those cases which have the most, which cohere to the model the most. So, if you've got an antitrust and regulation corpus and you've got a banking topic, the top cases might be something that uses a lot of the terms like bank, security, price, things like that. Those aren't necessarily the ones that have the most precedential value. And I think that makes sense because a case that comes up as a top case using topic modeling simply just uses the words, and they may do a really good or really poor job of analyzing. Whereas top cases that have a lot more precedential value, it's supposed to be that they've thought more deeply about it. But I do think that in certain instances where it's very open-ended, say, the definition of market power, for instance, there are all of these like salutary citations to these cases, like empty citations that you just kind of throw in that don't have a lot of meaning. So I think that this technology will really challenge the way that precedent is made. And I don't think that necessarily precedent has to change that much, the way precedent is made. And on your final point of do ideas or methods drive the law, I do think that, these methods have a lot of promise, and I think they're very interesting, but I'm always mindful of the equity aspect, which is they're, because they're barriers to entry, they can't be used very equitably by everybody. And so, certain segments of society won't be able to afford these tools. And so I do worry about, the kind of like the standardization and the digitization of methods of analysis and law and how fair that might be. There's a criticism out of digital humanities that by turning toward these quantitative methods, you're making universities very susceptible to capture by grant-making institutions that can fund the construction of these projects. So I'm mindful of that and mindful of law not becoming like that. But for now, I think it's an interesting way to think about how we think about case law.
Right. So, Professor Luciana, I want to make use of word a little bit, maybe for final remarks.
Well, I was just listening to these last comments by Vinicius and Professor Chang. I think that we have a lot of challenge, not only the technical ones that I mentioned in my talk, but also in how to, even these social implications that using more this quantitative methods. I mean, we still have a long way to go here, but how to do that in really also in a fair manner, and really towards, fostering and developing good regulation and good legal studies. And I think that this is just the beginning. And I mean, lots of challenge with lots of opportunities, as I mentioned. But I'm really excited about that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, me too. Professor Felix, want to give us sort of a final remarks or reasoning remarks, and then Professor Vinicius, then we close.
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of setting the context in two things. So one is this balance between antitrust and regulation. It's still being fought. I mean, I think that as a doctrinal matter, you have this really interesting alignment. A lot of people believe that Trinco was wrongly decided and that Trinco maybe had forced antitrust to defer too much to regulation. So we'll see. We're in kind of now with the new administration in a different regulatory landscape, one that's not premised so much on rolling back regulations. So we'll see what if Trinco is kind of that balance is reset, what that might look like, because that'll be dependent on who, I think, the executive branch as well. And so in terms of quantitative methods and where we go from here, I think it's still rather open-ended. I think that there's just so much that's really exciting about this stuff. Stanford University now has a quantitative computational antitrust project that's led by Thibault Chappelle, who I think is on your advisory board. So there are a lot of people who are interested in quantitative methods, and not just as a method of research, but as a way of probably standardizing decisions. So certain jurisdictions, for instance, the Chinese, for instance, have really embraced machine learning and AI to standardize decision making. And I think that where we have to think about the balance is how much to push back, because do you really want standardized decision making, or can justice be better served if you've got more discretion? I think that'll be where the next wave of pitched academic battles will unfold.
Right, Vinicius.
Well, thank you very much. I learned a lot with two professors and two very important presentations, and I really think that this teamwork is like a big lesson, and that you guys made in Cincinnati, and we probably will try to make it in Brazil, and maybe you can achieve some success here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for being with us until now. And I was blessed with this conversation. And Professor Felix, Professor Luciano, as always, brilliant. Professor Vinicius Klein, thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon. Maybe
thank you, everyone.
Pursuing some study together. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.